Records retrieved from the private estate of the late Lycan historian Arthur Pendleton reveal a truth the High Council tried desperately to bury. It is a story of blood, frost, and a twist of fate so profound it rewrote the ancient hierarchy of the nocturnal world. A blind Omega, deliberately abandoned to freeze in a brutal sub-zero snowstorm, heard a sound that would break a seasoned warrior's mind, a monstrous, earth-shattering howl. She had no idea the cry belonged to the alphaking, a man her pack considered a terrifying myth. She only knew he was in pain. And so the blind girl walked straight into the abyss. To understand the sheer magnitude of the events that transpired in the winter of 2014, one must look at the untiled medical diaries of Dr. Harrison Croft, a physician embedded within the Ironhold pack. His notes describe a young woman named Sylvie in tragic detail. Sylvie was an Omega, but her status wasn't the sole reason for her absolute misery. She was completely blind. Her blindness was not a genetic defect, which the wolf healing factor usually corrected at birth. According to Croft's hidden files, Sylvie lost her sight at the age of 12 during a violent hazing ritual orchestrated by Alpha Tobias's daughter, Beatrice. A reckless shove had sent Sylvie tumbling down a rocky ravine, resulting in severe cranial trauma and optic nerve damage. Because she was an Omega, Tobias forbade the pack healers from wasting precious resources or their energy on her recovery. Her wolf spirit, deeply suppressed by abuse, could not heal her human eyes. From that day forward, Sylvie's world was plunged into perpetual darkness, illuminated only by scent, sound, and the shifting air currents of the Ironhold estate. Ironhold was a militant pack nestled deep in the unforgiving jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Alpha Tobias ruled with an iron fist and a heart of ice. To him, weakness was a disease, and Sylvie was its physical embodiment. She was relegated to the lowest of chores, scrubbing the meat cellars, washing blood-stained training garments, and tending to the roaring hearths in the dead of winter. The turning point occurred on the eve of the winter solstice. The solstice hunt was a sacred, brutal tradition where the strongest warriors tracked elk through the deepest snows, and the Omegas were forced to act as beaters, flushing out the game. It was 20 degrees below zero, and the wind howled like a chorus of dying ghosts. Sylvie, shivering in threadbare wool that offered no protection against the biting frost, was ordered to the far eastern ridge. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. "Stay on the ridge until you hear the horn, blind girl," Tobias had sneered, his breath reeking of stale whiskey and cured meat. "If you wander off and fall into a gorge, nobody is coming to dig you out." Sylvie had simply nodded, her sightless, milky blue eyes cast downward. She clutched a walking stick made of splintered pine, her bare fingers blue with cold. She knew the layout of the eastern ridge by the texture of the bark and the smell of the lichen, but she also knew the incoming storm system, which she could smell as a sharp metallic tang in the atmosphere, was going to be unprecedented. As the hours dragged on, the snowfall thickened into a whiteout blizzard. The temperature plummeted further. Sylvie stood by a massive oak tree, her sensitive ears straining over the roar of the wind for the sound of the hunting horn. It never came. Instead, she smelled the distinct, sickening odor of betrayal, the fading scent of the Ironhold hunting party moving back toward the safety of the main compound, deliberately leaving her behind. They were sacrificing her to the storm to cull the weak from the pack. Dr. Croft's journal noted that Tobias returned that night claiming the Omega had simply gotten lost. Alone in the freezing wilderness, a profound numbness began to seep into Sylvie's bones. The physical pain of the cold slowly faded into a dangerous, sleepy lethargy. She sank to her knees at the base of the oak tree, pulling her thin coat tight around her fragile frame. Her inner wolf, a small, weak voice in her mind, whimpered in defeat. She closed her eyes, preparing to let the frost claim her. Then she heard it. It didn't sound like a wolf, not an ordinary one. The cry that tore through the howling blizzard was a primal, earth-shaking vibration that rattled the pine needles from the branches above her and resonated deep within her chest cavity. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated dominance, laced with agonizing pain. The sheer force of the howl forced Sylvie's eyes wide open, even though she could see nothing but darkness. In normal pack dynamics, an Omega's instinct upon hearing a dominant predator is to cower, hide, or run, but this howl triggered something entirely different within her blood. It wasn't a threat, it was a summons. The raw anguish in the cry tugged at the very core of her empathetic nature. Her inner wolf, silent and subdued for nearly a decade, suddenly snapped to attention, pushing against her consciousness with frantic, desperate energy. "We have to go to him," the voice echoed in her mind. Sylvie forced herself up on trembling, frost-bitten legs. Using her pine stick, she began to navigate through the blinding storm. Every step was an agony. The snow was up to her thighs, and the wind whipped ice crystals against her cheeks like shattered glass. Because she was deprived of sight, her other senses had become supernatural, even by werewolf standards. She ignored the confusing, swirling winds and focused entirely on the auditory and olfactory trails. The howl came again, weaker this time, originating from the treacherous territory known as the Black Needle, a jagged expanse of rock where even iron-holed warriors refused to tread. As she pushed forward, a strange scent cut through the sterile smell of snow and ozone. It was rich, intoxicating, and impossibly ancient. It smelled like crushed dark amber, heavy rain on dry earth, and the sharp, coppery sting of freshly spilled blood. The scent hit her like a physical blow, sending a wave of unprecedented heat through her shivering body. The freezing lethargy vanished, replaced by an adrenaline surge that defied medical logic. Unbeknownst to her, Sylvie was not tracking a lost iron-holed warrior or a rogue wolf. The private logs of the Lycan Council later confirmed that King Silas of the Northern Territories had been missing for 3 days following a coordinated ambush. Silas was a legend, an alpha of such terrifying power that mere rumors of his presence kept entire continents in check. He was a ruthless, solitary monarch, known for his cold calculations and unmatched brutality in battle. Yet, here he was, somewhere in the dark, bleeding into the snow. Sylvie dragged herself up a steep, rocky incline, her hands scraping against hidden granite ledges. She fell twice, dislocating 2 fingers on her left hand, but the intoxicating scent of amber and rain drove her forward. She was a moth drawn to a terrifying, magnificent flame. "Hello," she called out, her voice raspy and weak against the gale. "Is someone there?" A low, rumbling growl answered her. It was a sound that made the air itself vibrate. It came from just a few feet away, emanating from the mouth of a shallow, rocky overhang. Sylvie froze. The sheer pressure of the aura radiating from the cave was suffocating. It felt as though gravity had suddenly doubled. Her knees threatened to buckle under the invisible weight of the stranger's dominance. "Stay back," a voice rasped. It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, laced with obvious agony and a dangerous predatory edge. "If you take another step, I will tear out your throat." Sylvie swallowed hard, leaning on her walking stick. "You're bleeding," she said softly, tilting her head as she analyzed the sounds. She could hear the wet, heavy rasp of his breathing and the distinct, rapid dripping of blood onto stone. "And you're trapped." Inside the shallow cave, King Silas lay pinned to the frozen earth, his massive frame trembling with suppressed fury and pain. The ambush had been meticulously planned by a faction of rebel alphas funded by an anonymous human billionaire. They hadn't tried to kill him outright. They knew his healing factor would eventually overpower conventional weapons. Instead, they had lured him into a mechanical nightmare, a heavy industrial-grade trap forged entirely from pure, unalloyed silver. The jagged metal teeth of the snare had clamped down on Tut, his right thigh, biting deep into the muscle and scraping against the bone. Silver was highly toxic to Lycans. It burned like acid, searing the flesh and completely halting the regenerative process. The poison had been seeping into his bloodstream for hours, weakening him to a state he hadn't experienced since he was a pup. He was effectively paralyzed, waiting for the rebels to return and finish the job. When he heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow, Silas had braced himself for his executioners. Instead, a tiny, fragile figure stumbled into the mouth of the cave. Through his pain-hazed vision, Silas stared at the intruder. She was incredibly small, wrapped in rags that belonged in a dumpster, her lip blue from the cold. But what arrested his attention were her eyes, milky, unseeing, and staring blankly into the space beside him. She was blind. And she was an Omega. He could smell the submissive, gentle pheromones radiating from her, undercut by the scent of sheer terror and freezing cold. Why is an Omega out here in a blizzard? His mind raced, fighting through the fog of silver-induced fever. "I told you to leave," Silas snarled, his eyes flashing a dangerous, glowing crimson. He tried to shift his weight to look more intimidating, but the movement ground the silver teeth against his femur, tearing a breathless groan from his chest. Sylvie didn't run. The logic of pack survival dictated she should flee from a strange, angry alpha, but the strange heat pooling in her chest anchored her to the spot. The scent of amber and rain was overwhelmingly thick here, wrapping around her like a warm, heavy blanket. "I can't leave," Sylvie said, her voice surprisingly steady. She dropped her walking stick and fell to her knees, crawling slowly across the rocky floor toward the sound of his ragged breathing. "The storm will kill me, and whoever left that trap will come back to kill you." "They will kill you too, if they find you here," Silas warned, his massive hands curling into fists as he watched her approach. She was completely defenseless, feeling her way across the jagged stone. "I am not a creature you want to be near, little Omega. I am dangerous." "You're dying," she countered simply. Her bare, freezing hand reached out and accidentally brushed against the hard muscle of his forearm. The moment their skin made contact, a violent electric shockwave tore through the cave. For Sylvie, it felt as though someone had struck a match in the center of her soul. A brilliant, terrifying warmth exploded from her fingertips, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the blizzard in a fraction of a second. Her breath hitched, and her inner wolf howled, not in fear, but in absolute euphoric recognition. Mate? For King Silas, the reaction was catastrophic. The ancient laws of the Lycans spoke of the fated mate, a soul bound to another by the moon goddess herself. Silas had spent 3 centuries believing the concept was a myth meant to pacify the weaker classes. He was a king. He needed no one. Yet, the instant this broken, blind Omega touched him, the agony of the silver poison was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, possessive roar in his mind. Mine. Silas grabbed her wrist. His grip was a vice of bruising strength, fueled by shock and sudden, desperate instinct. Sylvie gasped, freezing in place. "Who are you?" Silas demanded, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an intensity that made the stones around them tremble. "Sylvie," she stammered, terrified by the sudden realization of what that spark meant, and even more terrified of the monstrously powerful man holding her. "I'm from the Ironhold pack." Ironhold. Silas knew of them. A brutal, insignificant pack of thugs in the mountains. The fact that they had let their fated queen wander out into a blizzard to die ignited a wrath inside him that was infinitely more toxic than the silver in his leg. "Sylvie," he repeated, rolling her name over his tongue as if tasting it. "Listen to me very carefully. My leg is caught in a silver snare. There is a release latch on the right side of the mechanism. I cannot touch it without burning my hands to the bone. You have to open it." Sylvie nodded slowly, pulling her wrist gently from his grasp. She reached down, her sensitive fingers ghosting over his blood-soaked trousers until she felt the freezing, biting cold of the silver trap. She flinched as she felt the sticky heat of his blood coating the metal. "It's going to hurt," she whispered, her fingers tracing the complex gears of the rebel-made trap until she found the heavy latch. "Do it," Silas commanded, his crimson eyes lock onto her pale, frost-bitten face. Sylvie braced herself, gripped the latch with both hands, and pushed with all the meager strength her malnourished body possessed. According to a heavily redacted 2015 dossier leaked from Obsidian Security Solutions, a private military contractor secretly funded by oil magnate Alistair Sterling, the operation to assassinate King Silas was designated Protocol Frostbite. Sterling, a human who had discovered the existence of Lycans and sought to monopolize the mineral-rich territories under Silas's control, had equipped rogue alpha mercenaries with military-grade weaponry and liquid silver artillery. The dossier confirms what happened next in the cave was nothing short of a massacre, but it completely omitted the presence of the blind girl who triggered it. Inside the freezing cavern, Sylvie's frozen fingers slipped twice against the blood-slicked latch of the silver snare. The mechanism was incredibly stiff, designed to withstand the thrashing of a massive beast. With a final agonizing push that tore the skin from her palms, the heavy gears groaned. Clack! The silver jaws snapped open. Silas let out a guttural, breathless snarl as the pressure vanished, though the acidic burn of the silver remained in his bloodstream. He didn't waste a millisecond. His massive hand shot out, grabbing Sylvie by the waist and yanking her backward just as a volley of high-velocity, silver-tipped bullets shattered the rock where she had been kneeling a moment prior. The deafening crack of suppressed automatic gunfire echoed through the cavern. The hunters had returned. "Stay down. Do not make a sound, Omega," Silas commanded, his voice a vibrating rumble against her back as he shielded her fragile body with his own. Sylvie pressed her face against the icy stone floor, covering her ears. Despite her blindness, her acute hearing painted a terrifyingly vivid picture of the tactical assault. She heard the crunch of heavy tactical boots in the snow, The mechanical hum of thermal night vision goggles, and the distinct metallic clicks of weapons being reloaded. There were 5 of them. They smelled like synthetic combat gear, stale adrenaline, and the foul, unnatural scent of rogues who had forsaken their packs for sterling's blood money. "Target is immobile! The snare deployed!" one of the mercenaries barked, his voice distorted by a tactical comms mask. "Put a silver round in his skull and let's collect the bounty." Silas's chest heaved. The silver poison in his right leg made shifting into his full Lycan form impossible. The transformation would tear his weakened tissues apart. But King Silas had not ruled the northern territories for 3 centuries by relying solely on his wolf. He was a master of warfare, a predator who thrived in the darkest, most desperate corners of combat. As the mercenaries moved in, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, Silas struck. He didn't roar. He didn't announce his presence. He moved with a terrifying, silent velocity that defied his massive injuries. Sylvie heard the sudden, sickening sound of bone snapping like a dry branch, followed instantly by a wet, choked gurgle. Silas had thrown a jagged piece of granite with such lethal precision that it crushed the windpipe of the lead mercenary. Panic erupted. The remaining 4 opened fire, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the cavern in strobes of blinding light that Sylvie could only feel as sharp bursts of heat against her skin. But Silas was already gone from their line of sight. He used the cavern's low ceiling and jagged stalactites to his advantage, dropping into the center of the formation. Sylvie heard the horrifying sounds of hand-to-hand Lycan combat, the tearing of Kevlar, the shattering of tactical helmets, and the wet, heavy thuds of flesh being brutally dismantled. Silas fought with calculated, monstrous efficiency. He used their own momentum against them, ripping a silver-loaded rifle from one rogue's hands and using the heavy stock to cave in another's chest. In less than 40 seconds, the gunfire ceased. The cavern fell, dead silent, save for the howling wind outside and the heavy, ragged breathing of the alphaking. The scent of blood in the air was suffocating. Sylvie lay trembling on the floor, her mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated violence she had just witnessed through sound. "Sylvie." His voice was softer now, though still strained with pain. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached her. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. A massive, incredibly warm hand gently touched her shoulder, a stark contrast to the lethal force it had just exerted. "Are you hit?" Silas asked, his thumb lightly brushing the side of her neck to check her pulse. It was racing like a trapped bird's. "No," she breathed out. "I'm okay." "You are freezing," he noted, his tone turning dark. He stripped the heavy, fur-lined trench coat from his own shoulders, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and wrapped it tightly around her small frame. The coat dwarfed her, but it was saturated with his heat and the intoxicating scent of amber and rain. As he leaned in to adjust the collar, Silas paused, his heightened senses slowly clearing of the battle adrenaline, finally registered the finer details of the girl trembling in front of him. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave a different kind of tempest was brewing. Silas knelt awkwardly on his good leg, his glowing crimson eyes scanning Sylvie's face. Dr. Croft's hidden diaries noted that omegas often emitted a faint scent of distress, a natural byproduct of their low status. But the scent pouring off Sylvie was a deeply ingrained historical tapestry of chronic abuse, malnutrition, and profound medical neglect. Silas reached out, his large calloused fingers gently tilting her chin upward. He stared into her milky blue eyes. Lycan blindness was exceptionally rare. Their cellular regeneration almost always repaired ocular damage. For a wolf to remain permanently blind, the trauma had to be catastrophic and the healing process intentionally suppressed. He leaned closer, his nose brushing her temple as he inhaled deeply. He wasn't just smelling her skin. He was analyzing the biological history etched into her bones. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of old, calcified blood beneath her scalp. He smelled the rigid, improper fusion of a fractured orbital bone. And beneath it all, he smelled the sickening, unnatural suppression of her inner wolf, a spirit that had been systematically starved and terrified into submission, preventing it from healing its human host. "Who did this to you?" Silas's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried a seismic weight that made the rocks around them vibrate. Sylvie flinched, pulling back slightly. It was an accident. A long time ago. "Do not lie to me, little mate," he growled softly, his thumb tracing the faint, jagged scar hidden just behind her hairline. "Your skull was fractured. Your optic nerves were severed. Your wolf was denied the sustenance and safety required to heal your eyes. This was not an accident. This was a slow, deliberate execution." Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over Sylvie's pale cheeks. She had never spoken the truth out loud. In the Ironhold Pack, speaking against the Alpha's bloodline was treason, punishable by flaying. But the terrifying, comforting presence of this stranger, her mate, broke through her conditioned silence. "Beatrice," Sylvie whispered, her voice breaking. "Alpha Tobias's daughter. I was 12. I dropped her ceremonial gown in the mud. She pushed me into the jagged ravine at the edge of the territory. The healers weren't allowed to treat me. Alpha Tobias said it was a waste of herbs on an omega." Silas closed his eyes. The sheer audacity of it defied comprehension. A backwater, insignificant Alpha had deliberately crippled and tortured the fated mate of the Lycan king. The anger that ignited within Silas's chest was not the hot, explosive rage of a battle. It was a cold, absolute and apocalyptic fury. He slowly opened his eyes, the crimson glow now bleeding into a blinding, luminous gold, the mark of a fully realized king. "Tobias of Ironhold," Silas repeated the name, carving it into his memory like an epitaph. He looked down at Sylvie, who was clutching the lapels of his massive coat. She was so incredibly fragile, a broken sparrow left to freeze in the snow. "What is your last name, Sylvie?" he asked, his tone shifting into one of absolute terrifying authority. "I don't have one," she replied softly. "Omegas in Ironhold aren't given surnames." "You do now," Silas stated, his voice resonating with the ancient power of the Lycan laws. He carefully scooped her up into his arms, ignoring the agonizing protests of his torn leg muscles. He held her against his chest, shielding her completely from the biting wind that whipped through the cave entrance. "You are Sylvie of the House of Vane. You are the fated queen of the Northern Territories. And, before the next moon rises, the Ironhold pack will cease to exist." Sylvie gasped, her blind eyes widening as the weight of his words crashed over her. "The Northern Territories? But that means you're—" "King Silas," he confirmed, pressing a gentle, possessive kiss to her cold forehead. "And you, my brave, foolish girl, are never going to scrub another floor or freeze in the dark ever again." Outside, the blizzard began to break, the howling winds dying down to a low, mournful moan. The dawn was approaching, casting a pale, icy light over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Silas adjusted his grip on her, his golden eyes fixed on the distant, faint smoke rising from the Ironhold compound in the valley below. He had survived the silver. He had found his queen. Now it was time for the king to deliver his justice. According to the compiled historical dossiers of Arthur Pendleton, the descent from the treacherous peaks of the Black Needle should have been a suicide mission for both of them. King Silas's right leg was heavily compromised. The liquid silver from the mercenary snare had breached his muscular fascia, leaving a horrific trail of blackened, necrotic tissue that actively fought against his natural Lycan regeneration. Medically speaking, the toxin should have stopped his heart before they reached the tree line. However, the ancient biological texts of the lycanthrope species detail a rare, almost mythic, physiological response known as the Aegis surge. When a dominant alpha discovers their fated mate in a state of mortal peril, the biological imperative to protect overrides all physical trauma. The brain floods the nervous system with an unprecedented cocktail of adrenaline and localized endorphins, temporarily neutralizing the paralyzing effects of silver. Silas carried Sylvie through the waist-deep snowdrifts of the Bitterroot Mountains, his massive chest radiating a furnace-like heat that acted as a biological shield, keeping her from slipping back into the fatal grip of hypothermia. Sylvie clung to him, her fragile arms wrapped tightly around his thick neck, her face buried in the collar of his blood-stained trench coat. Because she was entirely deprived of sight, her sensory experience of the journey was overwhelmingly magnified. She felt the terrifying, rhythmic thud of his massive heart against her ribs. She smelled the metallic, acidic tang of his poisoned blood mixing with the intoxicating, ancient scent of crushed amber and rain. For the first time in her miserable existence, Sylvie felt an absolute, impenetrable sense of safety. The freezing wind that had threatened to claim her life just hours ago now felt like a distant, powerless nuisance. "We are approaching the eastern perimeter," Silas murmured. His voice was a dark, steady rumble that vibrated directly against her cheek, offering a startling contrast to the lethal violence she knew he was capable of unleashing. Through her blindness, Sylvie's hypersensitive hearing immediately painted the landscape. She could hear the distinct, heavy wooden groan of the Ironhold compound's watchtowers swaying in the fading storm. She smelled the thick, greasy wood smoke billowing from the massive stone chimneys of the great hall. Beneath the smoke, she caught the scent of roasting elk from the solstice hunt, mingled with the sour, fermented odor of spilled ale and arrogance. The pack was celebrating. They were toasting to a successful winter hunt and the culling of the weak, completely unaware that their alpha had just orchestrated the assassination of their sovereign king. They were even more oblivious to the fact that the blind omega they had deliberately left to freeze to death on the ridge had just survived the night, and she was returning in the arms of a god. Sylvie began to tremble violently. It wasn't the winter cold. It was the deeply conditioned psychological terror of returning to her lifelong prison. "King Silas," Sylvie whispered, her voice cracking as her knuckles turned white against his coat. "There are over 60 fully grown wolves inside that perimeter. Alpha Tobias has armed sentries stationed on the watchtowers. If they see you wounded—" "Let them look upon me," Silas replied coldly. He did not break his stride. He didn't attempt to utilize the surrounding pine forests for stealth. He didn't demand an audience through the traditional pack comms. King Silas walked straight out of the blinding whiteout and directly up to the reinforced 20-foot ironwood gates of the Ironhold compound. Without setting Sylvie down and ignoring the agonizing burn in his poisoned leg, he delivered a single devastating kinetic strike to the center of the barricade with his uninjured left boot. The resulting sound defied the laws of ordinary physics. It was not a thud. It was the concussive detonation of a military-grade explosive. The heavy, forged iron hinges shrieked in protest before violently snapping off their stone mountings. The massive wooden doors, specifically designed by Tobias to withstand a prolonged siege from rival packs, splintered inward. They crashed into the snow-covered cobblestones of the main courtyard with a localized shockwave that rattled the windows of the surrounding cabins and sent a plume of white powder 50 feet into the air. Inside the courtyard, the raucous solstice celebration ground to a horrifying, instantaneous halt. Dozens of Ironhold warriors, many still nursing their morning hangovers with heavy tankards of ale, froze in their tracks. The laughter died in their throats. Standing in the ruined, smoking archway was a nightmare made flesh. Silas towered at 6'5", covered in a terrifying mixture of frozen ash, mercenary blood, and snow. His golden eyes burned with an apocalyptic, unnatural light that cut through the winter gloom. And, held effortlessly in his arms, draped in his royal crest, was the blind omega they had all condemned to the abyss. Before a single sentry could draw a weapon or sound the alarm horn, Silas unleashed his alpha aura. It was not a physical attack, but it hit the Ironhold pack with the devastating force of a tidal wave. Dr. Harrison Croft's personal journals later described the physiological event as a sudden, catastrophic drop in barometric pressure within the compound walls. The sheer, unadulterated dominance of the Lycan king slammed into the courtyard like a physical weight. Seasoned Ironhold enforcers, men and women who had killed rogues with their bare hands, instantly collapsed to their knees. Tankards shattered against the stones. Wolves gasped for air, clutching their chests as their inner spirits submitted violently to the absolute apex predator in their presence. The suppression was so intense that several younger wolves vomited into the snow, unable to handle the biological imperative forcing them to bow. The heavy oak doors of the great hall burst open. Alpha Tobias stepped out onto the balcony, his face flushed with a mixture of drunken rage and sleep deprivation. He was flanked closely by his daughter, Beatrice, who was still draped in her lavish, fur-lined solstice gown. "Who dares breach my gates?" Tobias roared, his voice cracking. He tried to push his own alpha presence outward to counteract the oppressive gravity in the courtyard, his blood fiercely resisting the command to kneel. But when Tobias's bloodshot eyes finally focused through the settling snow dust and landed on Silas, the arrogant color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, terrifyingly pale mask of realization. "Tobias," Beatrice stammered. She stumbled backward, bumping against the wooden railing. Her sneer vanished entirely. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the small figure in the king's arms. That's her. That's the blind girl. The Omega." "Tobias of Ironhold," Silas's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but the low frequency resonated so deeply it echoed off the mountain peaks and rattled the teeth of every kneeling wolf in the courtyard. Silas slowly, carefully lowered Sylvie to her feet. He kept one large, protective hand resting firmly on the back of her neck, physically grounding her and shielding her from the hostile, terrified sense of her former abusers. "You conspired with human mercenaries," Silas stated, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "You allowed Alistair Sterling's corporate strike force into my sovereign territory. You fed them my private coordinates, and you supplied them with liquid silver artillery." A collective, horrified gasp echoed from the kneeling pack. The warriors looked up, their eyes wide with betrayal. Treason against the crown was a crime so severe it mandated the execution of the entire leadership bloodline. Tobias had sold them out to a human billionaire. "Lies!" Tobias spat, though his knees were visibly shaking against the balcony wood. He looked frantically down at his paralyzed warriors, his panic overriding all logic. "Kill him! He's wounded! Look at his leg, the silver is eating him alive! He's bleeding out, you pathetic cowards! Take him down!" Not a single warrior twitched. The oppressive weight of the king's aura made it anatomically impossible for them to rise against him. "And infinitely worse than your treason," Silas continued. He took a limping, yet terrifyingly deliberate step forward into the courtyard, his golden eyes locking onto Tobias like a targeting laser. His voice dropped to a lethal, vibrating whisper that carried over the dead silence of the pack. "You tortured my fated mate." According to the unsealed transcriptions of Dr. Harrison Croft, later verified by lycanthropology historian Arthur Pendleton, the standoff in the Ironhold courtyard was not merely a physical confrontation. It was a localized atmospheric anomaly. The sheer suffocating gravity of King Silas's alpha aura caused a measurable drop in barometric pressure. The snowflakes that had been gently falling suddenly seemed to freeze in, mid-air, suspended by the violent, oppressive energy radiating from the bleeding monarch. 60 seasoned Ironhold warriors were forced onto the frozen cobblestones, their knees cracking against the ice. Their inner wolves whimpered, clawing at their human minds in absolute biological terror. They were staring at a ghost, a king who was supposed to be dead, bleeding toxic black blood from a silver snare, yet standing with the posture of an untouchable god. And in his arms, shivering but unhurt, was Sylvie, the blind Omega they had actively abandoned to the blizzard, The revelation struck the courtyard with the force of a physical blow. Tobias, Beatrice stammered. The Alpha's daughter stumbled backward, her ceremonial solstice gown dragging through the bloody snow. All her arrogant cruelty had evaporated, replaced by a primal, hollow dread. She pointed a trembling finger at the small, ragged figure huddled against the king's massive chest. That's her. That's the blind girl, the one we left on the eastern ridge. Tobias of Ironhold, Silas's voice boomed, a guttural, earth-shattering vibration that echoed off the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. He did not rush. Despite the acidic agony of the silver poison actively necrotizing the muscle tissue in his right leg, Silas moved with terrifying, deliberate grace. He slowly lowered Sylvie to her feet, placing his large, heavy hand on the back of her neck in a universal, ancient gesture of absolute possession and protection. He anchored her to him, shielding her from the hostile sense of her former tormentors. "You conspired with human mercenaries," Silas continued, his golden eyes locking onto the trembling Alpha of Ironhold. "You allowed Alistair Sterling's tactical strike force into my sovereign territory. You fed them my travel coordinates, knowing they possessed liquid silver artillery. You sold your king to a human oil baron for a seat at a table you will never be worthy to sit at." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the kneeling pack. Treason against the crown was not just a crime. It was an infection that condemned the entire bloodline. Even the most hardened Ironhold enforcers looked at Tobias with sudden, visceral disgust. "Lies!" Tobias spat, his face flushing a mottled, apoplectic purple. He was caught, but his hubris refused to let him submit. His mind, poisoned by years of unchecked tyranny over a small, isolated pack, snapped under the pressure of his impending execution. He frantically scanned his kneeling warriors. "Get up! Kill him! Look at his leg! The silver has crippled him! He's bleeding out, you cowards! Tear him apart!" Nobody moved. It was a biological impossibility. The oppressive weight of Silas's aura commanded their spines to remain bowed. "And worse than your treason," Silas's voice dropped from a booming roar to a lethal, deadly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the compound. He took a limping, yet terrifyingly powerful step forward, pulling Sylvie gently along with him. "You tortured my fated mate." The words hung in the freezing air, freezing the blood in Tobias's veins. Fated mate. The concept was revered as sacred text, a blessing from the moon goddess, herself supposedly eradicated centuries ago. To hear the king claim the lowest, most abused, blind omega of their pack as his bound queen was a reality too massive for their minds to process. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, broken wail of absolute terror. She collapsed into the snow, tearing at her own hair. She knew exactly what she had done to Sylvie a decade ago. She remembered the sound of Sylvie's skull cracking against the ravine rocks, the cruel laughter, the deliberate withholding of medical aid. Looking at the monstrous, golden-eyed king, Beatrice realized her death was going to be an agonizingly prolonged event. "She is an omega!" Tobias screamed, spittle flying from his lips in a desperate, suicidal bid to retain his dominance. "A blind, useless cripple! She is dirt!" His bones began to crack and pop with sickening loudness. In a final act of defiance, Tobias forced his body to shift. Dark, coarse fur erupted from his skin, his jaw elongating into a massive, slavering snout. He became a hulking 8-foot beast of muscle and rage, his eyes burning with frantic madness. With a terrifying roar, he lunged across the courtyard, aiming to tear Silas's throat out before the king could fully transform. Dr. Croft's journals note the profound tactical error of Tobias's final moments. He assumed Silas's injured state made him vulnerable. He forgot that King Silas had ruled the Northern Territories for 3 centuries, not just through brute strength, but through unmatched, predatory combat intelligence. Silas didn't even bother to shift. He remained in his human form, a supreme insult to Tobias's power, moving with a blinding, explosive speed fueled by the Aegis surge, the biological adrenaline overload an alpha experiences when his mate is threatened. Silas sidestepped Tobias's clumsy, fully shifted lunge. Silas's left arm shot out, his fingers hooking under the thick fur and muscle of Tobias's jaw. Using the massive wolf's own forward momentum against him, Silas pivoted, driving his knee into Tobias's ribs with the force of a freight train, ribs shattered like dry kindling. Tobias let out a choked, wet yelp, his massive body crashing down onto the frozen cobblestones, sliding several feet and tearing up the ice. Before the rogue alpha could recover, Silas was on top of him. Silas bypassed the thrashing claws entirely, his hands locking around Tobias's thick, muscular throat. "She is your queen," Silas snarled, his fangs extending fully, his golden eyes burning like miniature suns into Tobias's terrified, bloodshot gaze. "Her blindness is a crime you orchestrated, and it is a crime I am going to correct right after I rid this earth of your stench." Silas planted his good boot squarely on the center of Tobias's spine. With a single brutal and calculated wrench of his massive arms, a sickening crack echoed through the silent courtyard. It was over in 3 seconds. Tobias's massive wolf form went instantly limp, his cervical spine completely severed. The tyrannical reign of Ironhold died in the bloody snow. As the life left him, Tobias's body violently reverted to its human form, leaving a broken, naked corpse at the king's feet. Absolute, terrified silence reigned. "Dr. Harrison Croft," Silas commanded, his voice perfectly steady, barely out of breath. From the center of the cowering pack, a slender, silver-haired man scrambled forward, keeping his eyes glued to the cobblestones out of respect. He was trembling so violently he could barely hold his medical bag. I am here, my king." "Examine my mate," Silas ordered, finally turning his attention away from the corpse and stepping back to Sylvie's side. Sylvie stood frozen, clutching the oversized lapels of the king's trench coat. Her acute hearing had painted a horrifyingly vivid picture of the violence, yet beneath the terror she felt the intoxicating, protective warmth of the mate bond humming in her chest. "My king, your leg," Dr. Croft dared to whisper, his medical instincts briefly overriding his fear as he saw the blackened, smoking flesh around Silas's right thigh. "The silver is in your bloodstream. If we do not excise the necrotic tissue immediately, it will reach your heart." "My leg can wait," Silas growled, a warning rumble vibrating in his chest that made the doctor flinch. "Look at her." Dr. Croft approached Sylvie with agonizing care. "Luna," he murmured softly, using the ancient title for queen. He gently lifted a small penlight. "May I examine your eyes?" Sylvie nodded, her milky blue, sightless eyes staring blankly ahead. Croft carefully observed her pupils, the scarring around her brow, and the rigid fusion of her orbital bones. After a tense minute, the doctor stepped back, his face pale. "My king, The damage is extensive. The optic nerves were severed by blunt force trauma 10 years ago. Because she was an Omega, and because of Tobias's explicit orders, her inner wolf was deliberately starved of the energy required to initiate the cellular regeneration process. The tissue has calcified. It is permanent. Nothing is permanent, Silas stated, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He dismissed the doctor with a wave of his hand and turned fully to Sylvie. "Beatrice," Silas called out without looking at her. The girl sobbed hysterically from the snowbank. "You are stripped of your wolf. You will be permanently severed from the pack network, rendered human, and banished to the mortal cities. If you ever step foot in Lycan territory again, my hunters will mount your head on my wall." The punishment of severing a Lycan from their wolf was a psychological and physical agony worse than death. But nobody dared object. The remaining warriors pressed their foreheads to the ice, silently swearing their absolute fealty to the crown. With the judgment passed and the pack secured, Silas ignored the 60 onlookers, the dead alpha, and the biting cold. He knelt in the blood-stained snow directly in front of Sylvie. "Sylvie," he murmured, his tone shifting instantly from a terrifying warlord to a profoundly gentle, desperate man. He took her cold, scarred hands in his massive, warm ones. "I can't see you," she whispered, her voice breaking as a single hot tear spilled over her pale cheek. The reality of her permanent darkness was a heavy anchor dragging her down despite the merity of her rescue. "He said it's calcified. I will never see you." "Croft is a physician for ordinary wolves. You are not ordinary, and you are no longer a prisoner of this backwater pack," Silas explained softly, bringing her knuckles up to his lips and pressing a warm kiss against the frost-bitten skin. "Your wolf has been starved, terrified into submission, but she is bound to me now. The mate bond is a conduit, Sylvie. My strength is your strength. My healing factor is yours to command. Let her wake up. Let her heal you." As Silas spoke, he didn't just offer words. According to Pendleton's analysis of Lycan energetics, Silas initiated a deliberate, massive transfer of alpha vitality through the fated bond. Sylvie gasped. It felt as though Silas had poured liquid fire directly into her veins. The overwhelming, radiant warmth of his alpha energy flooded her malnourished system. It was a violent, biological awakening. Her dormant inner wolf, weak and frail for a decade, suddenly roared to life, feeding ravenously on the king's limitless power. "Ah!" Sylvie cried out, her hands flying to her face as an intense, agonizing pressure bloomed behind her eyes. It was the sensation of dead tissue violently resurrecting, severed optic nerves rapidly knit back together, sending sparks of neural electricity through her brain. Calcified bones softened and reformed. Shriveled blood vessels expanded, flushing fresh, oxygen-rich blood into her retinas under the sheer supernatural force of a fully awakened Lycan spirit. "Hold on to me," Silas commanded, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist, anchoring her against his chest as she weathered the biological storm. "I've got you. Fight through it, my brave girl." The agonizing pressure peaked, causing Sylvie to bury her face in his shoulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, as quickly as the pain had arrived, It broke. It began to recede, replaced by a cool, soothing, rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with Silas's steady heartbeat. "Open them," Silas whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that no one in the Northern Territories had ever heard from their king. Sylvie's hands trembled as she lowered them from her face. Her eyelashes fluttered against the harsh, morning air. At first, there was only blinding, agonizing white light. The winter sun, reflecting off the snow, pierced her newly formed retinas like needles. She squeezed her eyes shut, whimpering slightly. "Slowly," Silas encouraged, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. She tried again. The milky blue film that had clouded her vision for over a decade had entirely dissolved. Her eyes were now a striking, luminous, crystal-clear silver, the undeniable mark of a Lycan queen. The blurry, chaotic shapes and overwhelming colors began to coalesce. Shadows found their edges. The white blur resolved into the texture of snow. And then her vision snapped into razor-sharp, supernatural focus. The very first thing she saw was him. King Silas Vane knelt before her. He was terrifyingly beautiful. He possessed a sharp, aristocratic jawline shadowed by rugged, dark stubble. His face was smeared with ash, dirt, and the blood of his enemies. His dark hair was wild from the blizzard, but it was his eyes that arrested her breathing. They were a warm, liquid gold, glowing with a profound, absolute devotion that stripped away every ounce of fear she had ever known. Sylvie reached out, her hand shaking violently. Her fingertips made contact with his cheek, lightly tracing the harsh, beautiful lines of his face, mapping the breathtaking visual reality to the tactile memory she had formed in the pitch-black cave just hours prior. "I see you," she breathed out, a radiant, utterly disbelieving smile breaking across her face, illuminating the grim courtyard. Silas let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 3 centuries. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his golden eyes as a deep, rumbling, impossibly tender purr vibrated in his massive chest. "And I see you, my queen," Silas murmured, carefully scooping her up into his arms once more, finally allowing himself to wince as his injured leg took their combined weight. He turned his back on the ruins of Ironhold and looked toward the horizon. "Let's go home." Historical records confirm the complete dissolution of the Ironhold Pack following the winter solstice of 2014. Under the protection of King Silas Vane, Queen Sylvie rose from a broken Omega to become one of the most beloved and empathetic rulers the Northern Territories had ever known. Dr. Harrison Croft's unsealed diaries, later published by Arthur Pendleton, provided the irrefutable medical evidence of her miraculous healing, cementing her story into Lycan legend. The human billionaire Alistair Sterling mysteriously vanished from the public eye months later, his corporate empire quietly dismantled by Obsidian security operatives loyal to the crown. Sylvie, who had once been left to freeze in the endless dark, never walked in the shadows again. She ruled fiercely beside her mate, a living testament to the fact that the most powerful force in the Lycan world is not the bite of silver, but the unbreakable bond of fate.